A single human warship appeared. The suns themselves ignited. Marshal Orsin had annexed 11 systems and never once heard a fleet say no. He stood now before the hollow tribunal in the low blue light of the gallery dome, throatbox clicking softly between words, and asked for a 12th. Cradle Vey, he said. Unverified. Threat. Negligible. His ceremonial scars caught the light when he turned to face the vote board. Behind him, his second-in-command, a broad-shouldered officer named Tessic, kept his eyes forward and his hands folded, the posture of a man who had learned long ago that agreeing with Orsin was the only career path the hierarchy offered. 3 other war council seats sat filled the same way. Nobody in the room had ever voted against a petition that came preloaded with 11 prior successes. Elder Myrnacast watched from the delegate's bench, her 3-jointed thumb already pressing into her sternum. She had seen this petition succeed 30 times. She rose anyway. 11 systems annexed, 11 uncontested. Her voice carried without effort across the gallery. 300 years of tribunal speech had taught her exactly how much air a sentence needed. That is not a record of strength, Marshal. That is a record of never being tested. You have fought wars with nobody who could lose. 0 peer contests in 6,000 years, Orsin said, is not luck, Elder. It is doctrine. Doctrine, Cast said, is what you call a habit after it survives long enough to stop being questioned. A ripple went through the gallery, not quite a laugh, not quite agreement. I was present at first contact with the human species, 94 years ago. I watched a single human captain end a raiding standoff with one sentence, no weapon drawn. I have asked this body twice since then to treat that species as something other than a rounding error. I am asking a 3rd time. And the vote found you wrong twice, Orsin said. Not cruel, just final the way a closed door is final. A few delegates shifted in their seats. Most did not. The vote came back, 41-3. Cast sat back down. Her thumb did not leave her chest. 3 days later, on the bridge of the hierarchy flagship Bone-Rot Verdict, Navigator Pira Vancy logged a contact at the edge of Cradle Vey and almost didn't flag it as one. One ship, unarmed-looking, drifting, not running. She read the registry twice before she believed it. Single vessel, she said. Designation, Halcyon Watch. Crew complement 312. Earth defense markings. Orsin barely turned from the annexation charts glowing along the coral-grown wall. One ship. One ship, Marshal. He laughed, a dry click through the throat box. A candle lit against a furnace. He did not order a course change. Doctrine did not require haste against a candle. Tessic, beside him, allowed himself the smallest answering smile, the kind a subordinate wears when his commander has already done the laughing for him. Aboard the Halcyon Watch, the ultimatum had already arrived, scrawled in the hierarchy's looping diplomatic script across the comm display. Admiral Sira Holt read it once, standing at the narrow galley counter, then read it again. She filled the kettle without being asked to. She filled the cup without deciding to drink from it. It was her late mentor's cup, ceramic, a hairline crack down one side, kept whole through 3 evacuations by never once being used. She filled it anyway. A full cup, for a fight she hadn't decided to have yet. She set the ultimatum down, without finishing the second read. Admiral, Lieutenant Aldies stood in the hatchway, young enough that his voice still wanted to climb at the end of a sentence. They're asking for a formal response. Hold position, Holt said. Hold, Aldies blinked, not retreat. Hold. He waited for more. She didn't give him more. Holt had spent 31 years learning that the order people questioned most was the one that needed repeating least. She remembered, briefly, the Ember colonies, the calm chatter from 3 other commanders that day, all of them shouting different orders into the same dying channel, none of them holding. She had held. It was the only decision from that day she'd never once regretted, and the only one nobody had thanked her for, because holding doesn't look like winning until much later. Aldies had survived that evacuation under her command, same as half this crew, and he knew her well enough not to ask a 3rd time. He logged it instead. Position held, awaiting further instruction. Down in the engineering well, Mara Akafa ran her thumb along the edge of the compass her father had carried, clipped now to her belt loop, and pulled up the lattice diagnostics. The folded space ignition array had sat dormant in the Halcyon watch's belly for 19 years. It had never been fired. Not once, not in a drill, not in a simulation that counted. "You nervous?" Aldis asked over the open comm, half joking, mostly not. "I built the redundancy checks myself," Akafa said. 3 times over. I'm not nervous about the lattice." A pause. "I'm nervous about everything around it." She keyed the pre-charge sequence and watched the numbers climb from 0. "Aldis," she said, "tell the Admiral 6 minutes." 6 minutes for what? She'll know. Aldis relayed it word for word. Holt nodded once, set the teacup down on the counter without touching it again, and walked to the bridge. The Hierarchy fleet entered Cradle Bay on schedule, 200 warships unfolding into standard annexation formation, exactly as 6,000 years of doctrine prescribed. Orsin watched the formation lark from his command dais, satisfied the way a man is satisfied watching whether behave the way whether always behaves. "Marshal," Vancy's voice had an edge to it now. "The skiff isn't retreating. It's holding orientation toward the system's secondary star." "Symbolic," Orsin said, "or suicidal. Either way, irrelevant." He had annexed 11 systems. He did not change formation for one ship pointed at a star that had never mattered to anyone's strategy in the history of the hierarchy. On the Halcyon watch's bridge, Holt stood with her hands clasped behind her back, watching the same star on her own display. "They think we're standing still," she said, mostly to herself. Aldis glanced at her. "Aren't we?" "We are," Holt said, "on purpose." The charge indicator ticked past 1 minute. "I wish I could tell you the star stayed quiet. It didn't. Stay close." 5 minutes, Akafa said. Vancy's hands had gone still on her console, which was its own kind of report. Orsin noticed it the way he noticed everything aboard the bone rot verdict late, and with the certainty that nothing aboard his own ship could threaten him. "Report," he said. "The secondary star," Vancy said. "Thermal output is climbing, slowly. It could be a survey error." "Log it as 1." Orsin turned back to the formation display, where his 200 warships drifted into the last of their annexation geometry, a shape that had worked 31 times before this one. He did not eat standing, and he did not change doctrine for a flicker on a secondary sensor. Both were a kind of faith. Tessic leaned toward him, voice low. "Marshal, if the candle metaphor needs revisiting." "It doesn't." Orsin didn't look at him. 11 systems, Tessic. You weren't there for the first one. I was. The pattern holds because the pattern is correct, not because we've been lucky 11 times running. Tessic said nothing further. It was, Vancy thought, the closest thing to a disagreement she had ever heard pass between the two of them, and it had lasted 4 words. Holt stood on the Halcyon watch's bridge with her hands still clasped behind her back, watching the same flicker on a screen built for exactly this. She did not call it a survey error. She called it on schedule. "Admiral," Aldis said, "they're not slowing down." "They shouldn't," Holt said. "Doctrine doesn't slow down. That's the whole problem with it." He looked at her like he wanted to ask what she meant, then didn't. He had learned that too, the long way, watching her hold a line at the Ember colonies while 3 other commanders broke theirs. He went back to the calm board instead and caught a thread of hierarchy chatter leaking through an open frequency. Orsin's officers, confident, almost bored, already cataloguing Cradle Bay under secured. "They've started the paperwork," Aldis said, half a laugh in it despite himself. "Let them." Holt didn't smile, but something in her shoulders eased a fraction. It was the only light moment the bridge would get for a while, and she let it pass without holding on to it. Below, in the engineering well, Akafa watched the charge bar climb past the halfway mark and felt the old compass at her belt tap once against the console edge as she leaned forward. Her father had carried it through a war that hadn't needed a lattice like this one. He'd told her once, before she shipped out, that the worst weapons were the ones you only got to use a single time, because you spent your whole life hoping the day never came, and then it did anyway. She hadn't understood him then. She thought she did now. 4 minutes, she said into the calm, and went back to watching numbers that weren't supposed to exist outside a closed session file. That file had a name. Holt had read it exactly once, years ago, in a sealed briefing after Earth lost 3 colonies in 11 days to an enemy that didn't bother negotiating before it burned the first one. The room that day had been small, 6 people, no windows, the kind of room built for decisions nobody wanted a record of. An old engineer named Petrosian had laid out the lattice theory across a single cracked tablet, his hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from having done the math too many times to trust it without shaking. It only works once, he'd said, and only if the enemy commits to formation first. It is not a weapon. It is a door that only opens from one side, and we don't get to pick when. Someone had called the proposal extreme. Someone else had called it necessary. Holt, the youngest officer in the room by a decade, had asked the only question that mattered: who carries it? Nobody had answered for a long moment. Then she had said she would. She hadn't known, that day, that the answer would take this long to matter. In the end, they'd called it the Cinder Mandate, filed it, built it, and hoped to whatever was left listening that they'd never need to open the file again. She had opened it 3 weeks ago. Aldis didn't know all of that. He knew the shape of it, the way a junior officer knows the shape of a thing he's not cleared to see whole. He watched Holt's face for some sign of what came next and found nothing but the same patience she'd worn through the entire evacuation, the kind that made enlisted crews trust her and made hierarchy negotiators, on the rare occasions they'd met one, deeply uneasy. The fleet kept closing, 200 ships, unhurried, certain. On the bone rot verdict, Orsin finally turned his full attention to the secondary star's readout, more out of habit than concern. The numbers had climbed further than a survey error should climb. He frowned, the chitin along his jaw tightening where the old scars sat. Vancy. Still rising, Marshal. Cross-reference it against the annexation database. Has this star done this before? Vancy's fingers moved fast. No record of stellar activity at Cradle Bay, ever. Orsin considered that the way he considered most anomalies, as noise, not signal. 6,000 years of doctrine did not bend for noise. He gave the order to hold formation and continue the approach, and somewhere behind that order, buried under all that certainty, was the first thread of something he didn't have a category for yet. In the Tribunal gallery, 4 light days and an ocean of silence away, Cast felt the meeting stretch into its 3rd hour with no new motions tabled. Beside her, a younger delegate named Orvina leaned over. You still think about the human captain? From 90-some years back. I think about her today particularly, Cast said. Why today? Cast didn't answer right away. She pressed her thumb into her sternum out of habit, now more than distress, and found herself thinking, unbidden, of the woman who'd ended a hostage standoff with a sentence instead of a shot, nearly a century ago. She hadn't thought about that meeting in years. She wasn't sure why she was thinking about it now. 3 minutes, Okafor said. Holt nodded once, and didn't look away from the star. 2 minutes, Okafor said, and somewhere on the bone rot verdict, an alarm that had never once fired in 6,000 years tried to find a category for what it was seeing. It failed. Orsin stared at the readout a second time, certain his own eyes had made the error his instruments hadn't. The thermal bloom from the secondary star had stopped climbing in a line and started climbing in a curve. He had annexed 11 systems. None of them had taught him what a curve like that meant. Pull the historical archive, he said. All of it, every system the hierarchy has ever surveyed. Vancy's hands moved fast and came back empty. Nothing matches, Marshal, not in 6,000 years of records. Then it's new, Orsin said, and for the first time in the War Council's memory, His voice through the throat box didn't sound entirely certain it was talking about the star. Tessick shifted his weight. Marshal, recommend, we hold the formation back from full approach until... The formation holds, Orson said. It came out sharper than he meant it to, and he didn't correct the tone. Vancy noticed. She filed it away the way she'd filed away every other small crack in the day's certainty, a private ledger nobody had asked her to keep. Aboard the Halcyon watch, Aldis caught the shift in his own readouts too, hierarchy formation chatter going from board to clipped in the space of one exchange. He didn't say anything. He just watched Holt, who hadn't moved from the same spot on the bridge in 11 minutes, hands still clasped, eyes still fixed on a star that was, very slowly, starting to look less like a star and more like a held breath. They've noticed, Aldis said. Good, Holt said. I'd hate for this to be a surprise. It was the closest thing to a joke she'd made all day, and Aldis almost missed it, because underneath it her voice hadn't changed at all. That was the part that unsettled him more than the countdown did. She wasn't bracing. She'd already decided how this ended days ago, somewhere he hadn't been invited. Down in the well, HFY reached for the thermos clipped beside her station, habit, not thirst, and found it empty. She set it back down without refilling it, because there wasn't time, and because some part of her understood that this was exactly the kind of small, useless gesture a person made in the last ordinary minute before something stopped being ordinary. She checked the lock sequence instead. Green across the board. 1 minute, she said. In the Tribunal gallery, Cast rose from the delegates' bench for the second time that day. The session had moved on to unrelated business, a border dispute 3 systems over, dull and procedural, and she found she couldn't sit through it. She crossed to the communications officer's station, which delegates didn't do, and asked for a live feed from the Cradle Bay relay. The officer blinked at her. Elder, that channel is restricted to War Council. I am aware, Cast said. Open it anyway. He opened it. Whatever she expected to hear, it wasn't silence. The open, waiting kind. 2 fleets close enough now that even hierarchy doctrine had run out of new orders to give. Orvana had followed her across the gallery floor and stood now at her shoulder, saying nothing, which from a tribunal delegate was its own kind of solidarity. On the bone-rot verdict, Orson gave the only order doctrine had left him. Continue the approach. Annexation formation holds. It was the order that had worked 31 times. He said it the way a man says something he no longer fully believes, because the alternative is admitting he doesn't know what else to say. The hierarchy fleet did not slow down. The secondary star kept climbing. Holt watched the charge bar cross into its final stretch and felt, for the first time since reading the ultimatum twice, something that wasn't quite calm. It wasn't fear either. It was closer to the moment before signing a name on a document you'd already decided to sign, the part where your hand still has to do it. Lock confirmed, HFY said. Whenever you're ready, Admiral. Holt didn't answer right away. She thought, briefly and without meaning to, of the 11 days. Of 3 colonies that hadn't had a star to hold a candle to, and a closed room full of people who'd called this option extreme, and then built it anyway, because the alternative had already happened once, and no one in that room had wanted to explain a 4th time why nothing changed. Confirmed, she said. On the hierarchy bridge, the curve on the thermal readout broke its pattern entirely, climbing too fast now for any survey-error explanation to hold. An officer near Vancy made a small, sharp sound and didn't apologize for it. Orson felt the old hull breach ache flare in his hip, the one that only ever bothered him when something in the room had already gone wrong before anyone said so. Marshal, Vancy said, I don't think that's a star behaving normally. I know, Orson said. It was the first time in the War Council's memory he'd said those 2 words without an order following them. The fleet kept closing. There was nothing left in doctrine to tell it to do otherwise. In the gallery, Cast listened to the open channel silence stretch past a minute, then 2, and found her thumb pressed so hard against her sternum it had started to ache. She thought again of the human captain from 94 years ago, the one who'd ended a hostage standoff with a sentence instead of a shot. She hadn't understood that woman then. She was starting now, very late, to understand the shape of the pattern she belonged to. "Something is happening at Cradle Bay," she said, to no one in particular, and the communications officer didn't ask her to clarify, because he'd heard it too. A long, low change in the relay static, like the sound of a great deal of light deciding, all at once, to arrive somewhere it hadn't been invited. The relay static resolved into picture 12 seconds later, and on the bone rot verdict, every screen that could show the secondary star showed the same thing at once. It had stopped being a point of light. It was peeling. Orsin watched the outer layer of Cradlevay's quiet companion star tear loose in a slow, silent bloom of white, and he spent the first stretch of it simply not believing it. There was no order for this in the formation manual. There was no order for this in any manual. He had spent a childhood injury and a lifetime of service learning what doctrine looked like when it worked, and doctrine had nothing to say about a star arriving early. "Marshal," Vancy's voice had lost its edge entirely now. What was left was flat, the way a voice goes when the body has already understood what the mind hasn't caught up to. "Forward systems are reading the bloom. Sensors are saturating across the fleet." Orsin tried to raise the Halcyon watch on an open channel, because some smaller, older part of him still believed there was a conversation left to have. The channel returned nothing but the long white wash of radiation noise, the kind that doesn't carry words, only the fact that something enormous is happening nearby. He tried twice more. Then he stopped trying, and watched in silence as his own forward array logged the cascade reaching full bloom across a third of the visible sky. Beside him, Tessic had gone very still, the posture of a man recalculating 30 years of certainty in real time and finding nowhere to set it down. No alarms had been built for this. No doctrine had a name for it. Orsin stood very still, the old hull breach ache sharp in his hip, and understood, late, the way all of doctrine's children understand things late, that he had brought 200 ships and 80,000 troops to annex a candle, and the candle had been lit on purpose. On the Halcyon watch, Holt didn't watch the hierarchy fleet. She watched the confirmation light on Akafa's board turn solid, and she closed her eyes for exactly one breath. "Mark it," she said. "Marked," Aldis answered, hands steady now in a way they hadn't been an hour ago, and in his voice was the particular calm of a man who finally understood what he'd been ordered to hold position for. No warning, no declaration, no mercy in the old sense, only light, doing what light does when something finally lets it. The fusion wash rolled outward and found the hierarchy fleet exactly where doctrine had placed it. Tight, formal, perfectly arranged for annexation, and for nothing else. Forward shields buckled under radiation they hadn't been built to shed. Targeting arrays blinded across 200 hulls at once. Engines that had carried the hierarchy through 11 systems without resistance now simply refused to answer their own controls, scorched blind by a star that had, for 19 quiet years, been waiting for someone to ask it to. Orsin gave the only order left to give. Full withdrawal. All ships, full withdrawal. His voice through the throat box didn't waver, because 6,000 years of command had taught him at least that much. But underneath it, for the first time in 3 decades of unbroken record, was a man giving an order he had never once had to practice. The fleet did not fight. There was nothing left to fight with. It turned, blind and disabled, and ran. 3 days passed before the light reached the Tribunal's home system, a literal delay, the old kind, built into the universe long before anyone had doctrine to argue about it. Cast stood alone in the hollow Tribunal chamber after the session had emptied, the gallery seats cooling around her, and replayed the recovered transmission for the 4th time. It wasn't long. It hadn't needed to be. "We didn't bring a fleet," Holt's voice said, flat and unhurried, the recording catching the faint clink of a cup being set down beside her on some distant counter. "We brought a sunrise." Cast let it play once more before she stopped it. Orvina found her there afterward and asked, quietly, whether the vote would have gone differently if anyone had believed her the first time. No, Cast said. Belief was never the problem. Imagination was. You cannot vote against a thing your doctrine has no word for. She thought of the human captain from 90-some years before this one, and she thought she finally understood the shape of the pattern she'd spent a long life standing inside without naming. Patience wasn't the absence of a weapon. It was a longer fuse than anyone else had thought to build. Reports said Orsin had returned to hierarchy space and would face a tribunal of his own, the kind made of admirals who trusted a doctrine that had never been tested against anything that could answer back. He would survive it. The hierarchy's faith in itself would not survive it quite so cleanly. 340 captured flags still hung in a private hold somewhere, and for the first time in 6,000 years, none of them were the newest one. Aboard the Halcyon Watch, in the quiet that came after, Holt stood at the same narrow galley counter where this had started. The cup sat where she'd left it, full, untouched, the tea long gone cold. She picked it up at last and turned it once in her hand, checking the old crack along its side out of habit more than worry. It hadn't widened. She drank what was left, cold as it was, because some promises were worth keeping even after the fight that prompted them was over. Aldis found her there a few minutes later and didn't ask what she was thinking. He'd learned, finally, that some things didn't need asking. Nobody in the hollow tribunal asked what happened at Cradle Bay. The light answered before the question finished forming.